Hi, everyone. So I guess we'll get started. We may have some more people trickling in. Um, Start off, I want to say it's our privilege and responsibility to start the evening by acknowledging the land on which we gather for the Atlantic Book Awards Festival. With this event being held online, we're aware that a singular land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our distribution across many locations in Atlantic Canada and beyond. Because this evening's event is based out of Memorial University, we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. People watching this video from elsewhere are invited to consider their own positions with regard to the land where they find themselves. So, welcome to this evening's Atlantic Book Awards Festival event, Indigenous Settler Collaborations. Just a heads up that this evening's event will be recorded. I'm Kaylin Smith, a graduate assistant at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Tonight, I'm here with the Nexus Center for Humanities and Social Sciences Research. We present this event tonight in partnership with the Atlantic Book Awards Festival. A few points before we get started. The Atlantic Book Awards will be presented on Wednesday, June 7th at Paul O'Regan Hall and Halifax Central Library, starting at 7 p.m., hosted by author and journalist Lindsay Ruck. Tickets to the Book Award Gala are $20 and available online. The award show will also be live streamed for the book lovers everywhere. We have a couple more days of festival events featuring nominated authors. To learn more, please visit www.atlanticbookawards.ca, where you can also purchase tickets or access the live stream for the award shows. I'll put this link in the chat after. If any of you have questions for our authors while you're watching this evening, please type them in the chat. Our conversation will last about 45 minutes, and at the end of the session, we'll ask the authors as many of your questions as we can. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Sheila O'Neill. Sheila is a member of Qalipu Mi'kmaq First Nations and coordinator of Indigenous research and training at Aboriginal Employment Services Inc. She's the co-author of My Indian with Sahamo Misal Joe and their upcoming sequel, Suliyoe, coming September 15th from Breakwater Books. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kaylin. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this exciting event this evening. I'm just delighted to be here and to moderate this panel. I'm going to start by introducing the authors and nominees for the Scholarly Writing Award. I will read their bios and then tell you a little bit about their books, and then we'll start with some questions from me. All right. So, Lynne D'Arcangelis is an associate professor of gender studies at Memorial University, where she received a 2019 Dean's Award for teaching excellence in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Since 2005, she has been a white settler member of No More Silence, a Toronto-based grassroots network dedicated to raising awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. She has published on Indigenous, non-Indigenous solidarity, white settler feminism, and decolonial feminism in journals that include Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies, Atlantis, a women's studies journal, Canadian Women's Studies, and the German journal Periphery. Carolyn's book, The Solidarity Encounter. On the heels of recent revelations of past and ongoing injustices, the ongoing work of reconciliation and solidarity by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people has become even more urgent. But it is a complex endeavor. Grounded in a unique blend of scholarship, activist interviews, and autoethnography, The Solidarity Encounter breaks the theory-practice divide by taking readers into the fraught terrain of solidarity organizing in settler colonial North America. Political solidarity across difference is among the most crucial and challenging concerns of our time. Multi-issue coalitions such as Idle No More, No DAPL, MMIWG2SQ, Black Lives Matter, and Fridays for Future all depend on the collaboration of diverse communities, and for white women especially, on avoiding harmful detours into historically derived helping behaviors. Lynne D'Arcangelis grapples with this key problem. colonizing behaviors that result when white women sorry, this is important, I'm going to say it again. This key problem, colonizing behaviors that result when white women's self-interests take center stage as they participate in activist work with Indigenous women and groups. The solidarity encounter concludes by offering a constructive framework for developing non-colonizing solidarity that can be applied in any context of unequal power. This astute expose provides an invaluable set of strategies for resisting the solidarity impulse and respecting boundaries between self and other. Carolyn, congratulations on your nomination. Elizabeth Yeoman writes about language, culture, walking, and memory. She recently retired as professor in the Faculty of Education at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And her book, Exactly What I Said, Translating Words and Worlds. Exactly What I Said, Translating Words. My goodness, I do read. Start over. Exactly What I Said, Translating Words and Worlds emerged from a decade-long collaboration between academic Elizabeth Yeoman and Inuit elder and activist Janquish Elizabeth Pinashaway. An account of their work together, Exactly What I Said, combines theory with personal narrative, weaving together ideas, memories, and experiences of home and place, of stories and songs, of looking and listening, to interrogate the challenges and ethics of translation. Through storytelling grounded in linguistic scholarship, Yeoman depicts how walking together on the land with Pinashaway taught her innovative ways of understanding across difference. Elizabeth, congratulations on your nomination. Mark David Turner is a historian and facilitator who works at the intersection of media, performing arts, and archival practice in the Northwest Atlantic and Circumpolar North. He's from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is an adjunct professor at Memorial University School of Music. His book on Inuit Cinema. And Mark, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of the Inuit version of your title, please.
Inuit TakugatsaliuKatiget.
Thank you.
I'll write it out phonetically a little bit later.
Okay. And the book is edited by Mark David Turner. Since the invention of moving pictures, countless Inuit have worked in front of and behind the camera. The diversity and complexity of this body of work makes capturing and conveying its full scale a challenge. Together with Inuit filmmakers, media advocates and producers, as well as with their collaborators, colleagues, and families, on Inuit Cinema, I'm sorry, I'm going to read just the English, begins an important and overdue conversation. Composed of interviews, new writing, a catalog of moments in the history of Inuit cinema, and a filmography of 500 films and television shows, both about and by Inuit, On Inuit Cinema tells a story about Inuit cinema that centers on the people involved in its creation. With contributions from Sarah Abel, Asanajak, Kat Balu, Marie-Hélène Quasino, Inuk Silas Hyog, Madeline Ivalu, Blandina Makik, Stephen Agluvak Puskas, Lucy, I'm apologizing to anyone if I'm brutalizing your name, my sincerest apologies. Lucy Tulagaharjuk, Joby Witalatuk, and Fran Williams. So, welcome everyone again. And we'll start. I have a couple of questions prepared. And again, the audience, if anyone has any questions they would like to put in the chat for a bit later on. But we'll start with a couple that I've prepared. So this is a question for all of you, and you can decide who's ready to answer. But I hope that all of you have an answer or response to this. Your books, while different, share a common theme around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls for recognition of Indigenous knowledges and worldviews. Just really interesting that we're having this discussion tonight as it's Indigenous Peoples History Month, the month of June. And of course, the title of tonight's conversation is Indigenous Settler Collaborations. So with that in mind, can we start with a general discussion about how your idea for your work came about? Where did your idea start? What was your collaborative process? Who's ready?
Okay, well, I'll jump in, and please let me know if I'm talking too much. Just tell me, okay, that's it. But in hindsight, thinking about this question, the book was really years in the making. When I can't remember now, I forget how old I was, but it was a few years ago. I went to Australia, and it was the first time I left the US. I'm from the US originally in upstate New York, like Mohawk territory. And I'm not Indigenous. So anyway, when I went to Australia, it was like the Indigenous and all the racial issues became more stark for me outside of the United States. I was able to see the United States more clearly. And anyway, but more directly, this book comes from my work with No More Silence. You mentioned No More Silence. And it comes, so there's sort of two things that influenced my decision to do this. First, it was experiential. So I noticed that even though myself and other white settlers, and particularly white settler women, we knew the mistakes, right? We knew what we weren't supposed to do. And yet the Indigenous women around me still had that critique, or many critiques, of our behaviors and participation, paternalism and other problematic behaviors. And then academically, for my master's, I started reading a lot of Indigenous feminism. And again, there were critiques of white feminism. So in my mind, I wanted to sort of, dig in a little bit using my experience and the knowledge of other people around me, and try and put the micro in relation to the macro to understand how these problems get reproduced in the day-to-day. So that's a bit about my background. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth, Mark?
I can build. Do you want to go, Elizabeth? I don't want.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay, I just want to pick up actually on something that Carolyn talked about, because thinking about a response to this question, I was thinking about the sort of, there's a framework of catalysts, right? There's these sort of like larger impulses that I think that you have that you don't realize take a form until there's a specific event that actually gives it a form. So for me, I think in a way this is a book I always wanted to be involved in making, because as somebody who studied film, who's gone through, I guess, performance and media studies, like graduate work, there's remarkably very little written by any Indigenous people that's genuine, like that's accessible or that's circulated. It's not to say that the content isn't there, but it's certainly not in core syllabuses. It's certainly not stuff that's really kind of taught. So for me, it was always kind of percolating, but the immediate catalyst was the 2016 Inuit Studies Conference that I was involved in with the organizing committee. It was held at Memorial University. It was the 20th anniversary or 30th anniversary, I think, of when the conference was held in St. John's. And as part of that, we had a really robust film program, both within the conference itself and within two related festivals. And there was so much material. We actually couldn't program everything, but even at the events that we programmed, the conversations that were happening around sort of the stakes of cinema and like what it meant to like diverse Inuit communities across Inuit Nunat, so across the circumpolar north, it was absolutely fascinating. So after the conference, there was the requisite sort of, we need to publish some books coming out of this. And I said, well, I'd love to be able to do this, but what I want to do is find a way to build sort of on these conversations that were taking place. So it was, again, always the book that I wanted to write, but not knowing sort of what the form was going to be until I was in that context and saw people having the conversations and people willing to continue the conversation. So I'm very grateful to be able to be part of that process and to be able to, I think I've been part of something that gave structure to, again, this deeper kind of like impulse that I had.
Fantastic. Thank you. Elizabeth.
The idea for my book started, I suppose, or the prequel to it was when I first met Elizabeth Panashaway, when I made a documentary for CBC Radio about walking. And of course, she was one of the people I wanted to interview. I had different stories about walks, but as maybe most people here know, but maybe not everybody, every winter, she led a multi-week walk on snowshoes through traditional Inuit or Innu territory. And so I interviewed her about that. A couple of years later, I met her in person because I interviewed her on the phone or, radio. A couple of years later, I met her in person and she invited me to come on the walk. And I said, I love to come on the walk, only I thought it was only for Inuit people. And she said, no, it's for everybody, which is how she is, right? For anyone who knows her. And so I went on the walk. And after the walk, at the end of the walk, she asked me if I could help her write a book because she had been keeping journals for many, many years. This could be a much longer story, but anyway. And I really thought, oh, this would just consume the rest of my life. And I'm so lacking in all the skills necessary. But she was asking me, and I started to think about it, and I realized that you'd think I'm not the person. It should be an Indigenous person. It should be a person who at least speaks her language, Inuit Moon, and so on. But I realized that there were very few people with the skills, and they were very, very busy with many, many other things that required those skills. And she had asked me, so I said, okay. And then the next thing was to get some funding, mostly for me. Sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. I'll just ignore it. All right. So the next thing was to get funding for her book. And it wasn't my area of expertise, but we needed funding for various aspects of it. And so I started to try and build expertise in that kind of area. And I eventually, after getting some small grants, applied to SSHRC for a larger grant. And I said in it that I would write a scholarly book about the work as well as doing her work, because at that time, I felt at least, and I think it was true, that her book alone might not have been seen as a scholarly project that SSHRC would fund. I mean, that has changed over the years, but so I said I was also going to write a scholarly book about the work. And I think I may have talked long enough now, but this book that has been shortlisted for this award is the book that I ended up writing, really initially only because I wanted to get funding for her book. But that's how my book came about.
And then you were committed.
Yeah, and I was committed. And it did consume my life, the whole thing, but in such wonderful ways that I never dreamed would happen when I first took it on. So
fantastic. Thank you all for very interesting and real answers to that question. It's wonderful. So the next question that I have, and again for each of you, what was the most impactful for you as you were collaborating and researching and learning and writing? Just if there was something or some aspect or some part of it or some overall most impactful. Who would like to start? Shall we go in the same order as before?
If Carolyn is ready, that's fine. If not, I do have something, but maybe the same order is good. You want me to go, Carolyn? Okay. So I'll just to keep it flowing, because the most impactful for me was the language. And I mentioned that I didn't speak the language when I started working with Challenquest, and I've been learning ever since, but still far, far from fluent. But I did gain a kind of a reading knowledge somewhat of Inuit, and also just as we translated, because I didn't mention her diaries that we were translating for her book were written in Inuit, so we had to figure out how to translate them into English, and there were many words and ideas that were very, very difficult, maybe I could even say impossible to translate, because they came from such a different world. So I think that was the biggest, certainly one of the most impactful things was thinking about, and what does that mean? You know, that words that they use to describe the land have a very different set of connotations and references than words that we use to describe the land, or that most European languages are so built around gender, whereas Algonquian languages like Inuit are not. They're built around animate and inanimate. So I think that was the thing maybe that had the biggest impact, was thinking about what we could learn from those things. And that's a lot of what my book is about, really.
Yes, actually, as I was thinking, yes, that so much of your book was centered around that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, sorry, Mark, you want to go?
No, you go for it.
Okay, I'll go. So,
Jesus Christ.
anyway, so I think the thing that struck me the most was that a lot of the Indigenous women that I interviewed identified certain things as problematic, certain behaviors and maybe attitudes, but those same behaviors and attitudes were not described by the white women as problematic, even though they kind of talked about the same thing. It's hard for me to get into examples without talking a bit more in detail about the book, but just to sort of skirt the surface, you know, white women would talk about how they had personal outrage sometimes when they were learning about the history and the present day realities of settler colonialism. And they didn't understand, we didn't understand that as a problem. And the sort of problem with that is it keeps you at the individual register instead of thinking about your place in the collective. So anyway, it sort of sets off this chain of events where you can, you know, if you get close enough to Indigenous women, for example, then you can, you know, sort of prove your innocence or claim that you're a good settler. Anyway, it's very complicated, and that's sort of what the whole book is about, unpacking how that desire for proximity matches up with the liberals' individualistic subject and prevents us from seeing ourselves as members of a collective. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Yeah, for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, third question that I have for you, I'm going to appoint people. Should have started with that. Okay. So Mark, how about you? What was most impactful for you as you were collaborating and researching and writing and so on?
For me, it was coming to an understanding of what my role in this larger process was, and sort of reconciling any of my personal desires with the voices themselves. I had some personal objectives. I knew that like there was no sort of circumpolar kind of historical context for like how much Inuit have worked in film, like full stop. So I felt that it was important to be able to communicate that to a larger audience. I really wanted to put together something that was self-contextualizing and can speak to a settler audience, not necessarily. I think it comes out of a film criticism tradition, not necessarily like a film theory tradition. So I'm not like in that sort of realm of academia here with this book. And then at the same time, really wanting to take a back seat in this process, and just I had a lot of anxiety about even putting my name like on the cover as an editor, and how do I position myself? And the process was fantastic, but ultimately, I think it was actually the peer review process and working with some Inuit reviewers that kind of put things into perspective, because I think that they probably needed the content too to be able to, say what needed to be said, but about understanding that I need to be clear about what my motivations are in this, and that in not doing so, it's this is sort of echoing, I think, what Carolyn is saying a bit. Like it's another subtle form of colonialism. So it was finding that balance with my own voice and understanding what my role was in this process. And it's still, honestly, even though the book has been out for a year, I'm still learning about that, and I think that that's going to be an ongoing process about what my relationship is to this subject. And how it is that I can best position myself as an advocate for, an ally of, not an expert, not any of that, not somebody with academic specialization, but somebody that genuinely wants to see more communication by Inuit about Inuit cinema to a larger world.
Perhaps even an accomplice. Yeah. Oh, this is so interesting. I hope the audience is enjoying this as much as I am. So I have a third question, and after this question, I think we can turn it over to the audience for some questions they might have. So, in writing these books, as settlers, you've all described yourselves as settlers. You've taken a proactive role in dismantling settler colonialism, and we've touched on that a little bit already in your discussions. So what happens next? Like, not necessarily just your individual books, but the idea of Indigenous settler collaboration in general. Do you think, for example, your books were written at the right time? What should happen next? And I will start with Carolyn. And
thank you. Well, was this book written at the right time? Well, it took a long time to get it published, right? I originally did the interviews in 2011. So, the academic publishing process is grueling. And also I had to finish my PhD in the meantime. But anyway, so I guess I think this has been an issue of importance for me for a very long time. But I think with the publication of, the Truth and Reconciliation report, and also the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks, it's on more people's radars, more settler radars, should I say? So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to add to the conversation. So I think one thing I might say is that we should think of allyship in two directions and not in unidirectional terms. And what I think happens otherwise is you still, as the settler in this case, position yourself as, bestowing allyship on the more oppressed other. And instead of thinking about Indigenous people as allies in your struggle, or allies in struggle. And another thing I think that means when you think about unidirectional terms, it also implies that settlers need to engage critically with Indigenous allies. And, you should ally with people who share your politics, right? I mean, Indigenous peoples are not a homogeneous category. And I think, yeah, that's, all these are lessons I think that came out of the process of doing this work. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
So the question is about what next?
Yeah, so you've all taken a proactive role in dismantling settler colonialism, and maybe relevant to your book, but maybe relevant to the larger picture. What next?
I have so much to say, so cut me off if I go on too long. But coming down here to where I am right now in Nova Scotia today, we passed by near Windsor, near a lake. There's a sign that says Treaty Truck House. And my sister said, "What's a Treaty Truck House?" And if this was a class, I'd ask you all, does anybody know what a Treaty Truck House is? But so I only learned when I was writing my book what it is. But in Shubenacadie, which is also not far from where I am right now in Mi'kmaq, the Alton Gas wanted to basically destroy the river. I don't have time to tell you all the details, but the Mi'kmaq community in Sipeknekatik or Shubenacadie were resisting that. And in the 1753 Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Mi'kmaq, there was a provision that the Mi'kmaq people, at least under that treaty, could build a treaty truck house, which I think was intended to be a place to trade furs and so on. But that provision still holds. So they went and built a treaty truck house right beside Alton Gas, and kind of harassed them in a way. And they were allowed to be right beside them because of the treaty. And it became also a gathering place, as well as a place to monitor what was happening. And to make a much longer story short, they won. And Alton Gas eventually, after years of court cases and being bugged by people in the treaty truck house, announced that they were going to withdraw because it was too complicated. So when I saw this sign today, I thought, and then a Mi'kmaq scholar named Roger Lewis wrote a piece about treaty truck houses, which you can find by Googling. And he said that, maybe it was a really interesting strategy and there needed to be more of them. And so when I saw that sign today, I thought, okay, so maybe they're building more of them around other issues. And so to try and conclude quickly, really, I think we need to meet in small groups and talk to each other face to face. Like that's what they did in the treaty truck house. And they invited allies to come and hang out with them. They were delighted, it seemed, from what I gathered, just to have company because they were there day and night monitoring as well as building strength, But I think we need small groups where we have time, where we can talk and listen to each other, small places where we can go out to talk and listen to each other. Lots and lots more to say, but I like the treaty truck house both as a practical strategy and as a kind of metaphor for what we need. Yeah.
I am jotting that down. I'll be Googling right after. Thank you for that. Okay, Mark, over to you.
For me, I was very keen that any of the meager profits from the book actually go back to an organization called the Inuit Art Foundation that published Inuit Art Quarterly. And what I want to see next is more or less of me and more Inuit writing about this and me reading this as sort of a passive reader. At the same time, like my own personal motivations, I would love to see another edition of this book with more Inuit collaborators, to collect more and different perspectives. I do feel like the thing about publishing books, and I mean, like this event is testament to it, is that it creates communities of readers. And I think that when you have something that's that people can rally around, but also something that's indexed and that's searchable, there's a permanence, and it gives it, like, I think it underpins like a larger structure. So for me, I mean, my goals are to see more Inuit involved in this, and just me personally to have more conversations with more Inuit about cinema, because I feel like the artwork itself, I don't want to say it's half, it's like 98% of it, but like there's still like that kind of a missing 2%. I feel like where if we had more criticism, by the people that are making the films, I mean, I think that would just be absolutely like fantastic and create a space for dialogues with that. I've been trying to reconcile that though, because with the question of the issue of timing, because I don't quite know the answer to that part. I'm not certain that there's ever an opportune time to publish on this, or that there's ever a wrong time to sort of publish on this. I think to go back to sort of like the academic publishing process, this one took a long time too. This was like in development since, like, some of these interviews were conducted back in like 2013, 2014. And I think if there was a time where I would have loved to personally to have seen this book just sort of out in the world, it was around probably 2015, 2016, and during the moment of the discussions around cultural appropriation. And particularly, there was a lot of Inuit blowback to a film called Of the North by a Quebecois filmmaker named Dominique Gagnon, which was understandable. And it was a really, it was a fantastic community response to a very problematic document. And if anything, I just kind of wish that this book was around maybe as a tool and that toolbox when that was happening.
Fantastic. Oh, great discussion. Great and thoughtful and interesting answers. Okay. Those are the questions that I've prepared. And I'm wondering if any of the folks in the audience have some questions that they would like to ask any or each of the authors. You can put them in the chat. Okay, I have a bonus question while people are thinking about their oh wait, no, Robin Grant. Okay, and this is to everyone. Based on the synopsis of your book, The Solidarity Encounter, no, I guess it's just to you, Ellen. Based on your synopsis of your book, The Solidarity Encounter, you stress how important it is that Allied settlers avoid helping behaviors with harmful consequences. Key to this is when the self-interests of Allied settlers take center stage in their activist work with Indigenous groups. What are some examples of harmful helping behaviors, and what's an example of Allied interests taking center stage?
Sure. So I'll give, I think, two examples. One would be where, you have, this is maybe not that common, but I mean, I have seen it happen where, you're in a meeting and you being, a white settler person, you're learning about things for the first time maybe, and it's very, very upsetting, and you get visibly distraught and you that takes up space, right? And this is something that Indigenous women said, over and over again, like, yes, do your own healing, shall we say, but do it on your own time, right? So that's an example. Another example would be, and this gets back to, I think, I can't remember now if it was Elizabeth or Mark talked about sort of understanding why you're doing something, right? Why you're engaging in this work, whatever it is. And I think if you can be doing it without even realizing it as a way to be accepted by an Indigenous community or be healed somehow, right? So if this gets into the territory of appropriation, when some of the people that I spoke with, the women said, well, I really like being around Indigenous communities because women are respected and women aren't respected in my community. And so it's this sort of return to the self and what you're getting out of this, which can be problematic if it takes you away from the project at hand. I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea. Like, some of the stuff is really, really subtle, and some of it is more blatant, right? So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Great question, Robin. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to put in the chat? Okay.
Hi, Sheila. Sorry, is it okay if I speak instead of write? Because I have it half written and I can't type fast enough.
Absolutely.
So, hi, I'm Veronica. Elizabeth, this question is actually for you. First of all, thank you for bringing up the fact that Elizabeth Panashwe's work probably wouldn't have been viewed as scholarly if you hadn't have taken on your job of writing your book. Because Indigenous people in academia, we're all often talking about the value of unwritten stories. And I guess my question is, how would you suggest that we continue those stories? Or maybe that's not a very good question. How did you go about working with Elizabeth, like in a little more detail? I know you walked with her and learned about her stories, but getting it out there, really.
I think there are kind of two different questions there, Veronica. I think we've met too, haven't we, in Con River? Am I right?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Yeah. So hi. um, the first part where you said, how do we continue those stories? And so I was thinking partly about the continuation of oral stories. And I do want to say that scholarly funding in the whole scholarly world is gradually changing in terms of relating to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous scholarship. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but I'll just mention that. I think it's getting better gradually. And that's how we met, even Veronica, I think, through an event that was trying to bring people together from those worlds. But the oral, how to keep oral stories is a complex question, apart from, in the communities that they come from. That's a question too, but I don't know the answer to that one. I guess it's up to the communities, but I'm thinking that cinema is one part of that. And so Mark David might have a different kind of answer, or a better answer than I would, but I really think cinema has a huge power, and I've seen it in some Inuit films as ways that are closer to oral traditions. In terms of, I think the other part of your question was about the methodology I used with Chaunquesh or Elizabeth. So if you're talking about, for example, Indigenous people, and maybe particularly elders who are speaking Indigenous languages, and that's so difficult for them to, for instance, get funding when you can't, when you don't write in an official language of Canada. It's a huge challenge, but I think we could do far, far better than we do, we white people, we administrative people, and so on, in recognizing Indigenous languages, and sometimes taking on trust, even if we don't understand ourselves the language. My method working with Elizabeth was just to sit down together. I actually describe it in my book in a lot more detail, but to sit down together and listen. Yeah, that would be my short answer, I think, is on the part of the ally, to use Carolyn's language, not only Carolyn's, but I mean, your framework. So much, I think, is listening, just listening. And so that really is what we did. And through our lack of a very strong common language, Chaunquesh had her diaries in front of her, because she did have written documents, not oral stories, although she's from an oral tradition. And she would struggle to tell me what was written there, to explain to me. Anytime that she got stuck, she would phone somebody else who was more bilingual and ask them to explain to me. I would go back to her and say, okay, is this what you meant? It took a long time. And we really had to be sitting down together at a table and listening over, just the same as Mark and Carolyn said, it took a long time. All these books took a long time. But my short answer, having given you that long answer, is to do a lot of listening for the people who want to support keeping the stories going.
Thank you.
I'd like to interject, Elizabeth, and say, well done you for finding a workaround on the funding. And that's kind of what it's all about. I'm reminded, and I may not get this exactly right, but analogy that Chief Miss L. Joe uses is driving on square tires. And you push, and every time you get a revolution, it smooths the edges and makes things go a little easier. And it seems like maybe that's what I see happening here through all three of your books. Okay, are there any other questions? I was going to, maybe you've already answered this one, but I was going to ask if someone else were to approach you and say, I'm thinking about writing a book in an Indigenous settler collaboration on whatever, the topic not being the key to the question here, but what advice or best practices would you give to other settler scholars who are thinking about embarking on something like this, now that you've had your experiences collectively? I'll start with you, Mark.
I think Elizabeth said it. Listen. I was thinking about this. Just listen. like really listen. And I mean that in the fullest possible sense of the word. Listen in different places, maybe have conversations in different places, maybe listen on the land. If you do have that opportunity, it's a fantastic way to hear, and you hear different things. 100%. I've had the great honor of being able to do one of those walks with Elizabeth many years ago, and you hear different things. But I think it begins with listening. I don't know. Yeah, that's the fundamental. That's the fundamental advice.
Ah, great. Carolyn?
Sure, I would echo that, listening to you, Mark. So one thing I would add is this idea of refusal, which is not my idea. Well, for me, it came from reading an article by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, and they talk about how some knowledge is not to be shared, right? So Indigenous peoples can refuse to share knowledge, but not only that, if you're a settler person doing this kind of work, in fact, maybe you should focus on settler colonial structures and refuse to talk about some things, right? So I would add that.
Fantastic, thank you. And Elizabeth, did you have anything else to add in terms of advice or best practice?
I think I did already say the main thing, but Carolyn's point is a very important one too, and I think that is part of listening, but very important to be explicit about it, though, that it's also going back and checking to make sure that you got it right, or whether it should even be what you've been told should be used, or in what context, and so on. So yeah, that's all I have for now, I think.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Thanks, Carolyn, for giving us the authors of that piece of work. Okay, we're at about almost 15 minutes, so I think unless do any of you have any final comments or thoughts, or something you wished I'd ask but didn't? Carolyn?
Yeah, I was thinking about the hot button topic of Indigenous identity theft or fraud or pretendingism, whatever you want to call it. And this is not something I thought about too much when I was writing the book, but Dr. Kim Tallbear gave me some feedback at one point and said, gee, this is what might be helpful to think about that. Anyway, and what I thought of is that, of course, Indigenous identity fraud, you could almost think of it as the far end of a spectrum, a continuum, right? Because what the founding of settler colonial nation states is about taking, right? And so at some level, everyone, this is one of the theoretical underpinnings of the book, at some level, all of us who aren't Indigenous, want to feel belonging here, and that's, and so sometimes that has involved identifying as Indigenous, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but I think the bit about I don't think that pretendingism or that Indigenous identity theft or fraud is actually so far out there. It's almost like on a continuum. That's what I wanted to say without, I hope I'm not getting myself in trouble, but I think, anyway.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, any final comments or a question you wished I'd asked but didn't get to?
No, actually, Sheila, I thought your questions were great. I really, they were very thought-provoking, and thank you for them. And it was also wonderful to hear what Carolyn and Mark David, I don't know, are you called Mark David or just Mark? But
I'm just Mark. There's too many Mark Turners on.
Oh, I see. Okay.
This is the
okay. So interesting to hear how Carolyn and Mark answered your questions, and they were just really great questions. So thank you so much, Sheila, for the questions.
Welcome. Mark, I see there's one more question coming in, but Mark, did you have a thought?
I actually just want to echo something that Elizabeth said in an email when she and I and Carolyn were communicating last week. I really wish I had both of these books when I was doing my book. It's fantastic to see like this emerging body of literature. I mean, I say emerging. I feel like that these things are always nascent because there probably is really a body of literature. It's just very difficult to kind of shine a light on it. And I'm really grateful to be in dialogue with both of you, and I'm grateful to you, Sheila, for hosting this. But I look forward to reading your books, like really, and I look forward to like actually acting on their ideas, like when I continue on with this work. So thanks to both of you for the work that you're doing too.
Fantastic. One last question that came in from the chat. What about OCAP? Did that play into anyone's work?
I can quickly take care of that because OCAP doesn't apply to Inuit communities. There's a different set of protocols. Like there's a national Inuit strategy on research that Inuit TakugatsaliuKatiget is implemented. So it's a different set of protocols when working with Inuit communities. So OCAP didn't work in this particular context. Certainly, like the spirit of OCAP. I mean, I'm familiar with the
Yes.
principles, but not as a something that to be adhered to in a very strict sense, just because I have to abide by nicer.
Yes. Elizabeth?
I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know what OCAP was, and I just Googled it. But I gather it's a set of principles for research with First Nations people. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'll just say that people quite often said and still say of me, "Oh, you work with the Innu," and I would say, "No, I don't. I work with Chalkwash Penashwe. I don't work with the Innu." And so because of that, and because she had asked me to help her, and it was her project. I mean, I hope this doesn't seem like some kind of move to innocence in terms of research ethics, but I guess that's why I wasn't aware of OCAP or how it worked, I guess.
Yeah, and it may not have been a formal, like you were doing one-on-one research. So yeah, I get that.
Yes, that's it. That's my point. I guess it wasn't with a community, a First Nations community. It was with an individual. Yeah.
And so OCAP is ownership, control, access, and possession, and it comes to as you know, at a time when research would come in, they'd gather information and they'd leave and they'd interpret it in their own way, and the communities never heard how it was interpreted or never had it brought back. So, yeah.
Is there time for me to say one more thing?
Sure.
Quick. When I started working with Chalkwash, she said that she wanted to be really clear that it was her book and it was going to be her name only on the cover. That's what I'm here for today, but her book that came up first. And I said, yeah, that's fine with me. My name might be inside somewhere if I'm going to edit it, but your name on the cover, that's fine. And but that was one of the first things she said to me. And she talked about how over many years, people had, come and heard her story over and over. But from her, this was very thought-provoking, because I'm pretty sure that at least some, and probably most of those people who came and heard her story, saw themselves as allies and did everything in ways that were correct according to academic or journalist research ethics. But to her, coming from an oral culture, even though she writes, and a very different kind of tradition, she saw it as they came and heard her stories and went away and wrote them, and her name wasn't listed as author, right? But they were interviewing her, they saw it differently. So that's where it's maybe not even only about listening, but about making sure you're really, sometimes you don't even know what questions to ask, right? Because protocols are different. So it's very complicated, and you need to be very, very careful.
Yes. I feel like the conversation is really getting going now.
Yeah.
Carolyn, how about you?
Well, I have I think a similar answer to Elizabeth, because I was interviewing individuals, right? Individual white women, individual Indigenous women. So wasn't working with communities directly. I mean, that said, it was scary to share my results with people. Right. So I had my results. I mean, I did this a while ago, and I think even research protocols have changed. But anyway, I shared, if people wanted it, I shared that, this was ahead of any publication, right? Even the final, it was my dissertation originally. I shared, the segments where I quoted people and or the whole thing if they wanted it. And I have to say, many people were quite pleased, but there were some people who weren't. And I removed some stuff and I changed some stuff. And one person read the whole thing and really helped sharpen it, so that was, yeah, it was challenging. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I think looking at the time and I'm looking at the chat, and I think we've gotten all the questions. I think we can all be really happy that all three of your books were written. And I think that the impact they're having and can continue to have with respect to reconciliation and Indigenous settler collaboration is very important. And as an Indigenous person, thank you for your books and for having this very real and honest conversation about your work. Walalio. I'm seeing congratulations. Thank you for such wonderful books. I've enjoyed reading them all. Congratulations on your nominations. Congratulations to all the panelists. So sharing some of the fan love, as it were. So I think this concludes our discussion for this evening. Thank you all so very much for participating, and thanks very much to the audience who logged in. And just a reminder, the Atlantic Book Awards Gala is taking place Wednesday, June 7th at 7 p.m. And you can show up in person for $20, or you can join live stream. It'll be live streamed across the country. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.